One of the most painful questions you can ask in a relationship is this: are they pulling away because they need space or because they are losing interest? Those two things can look terrifyingly similar in the beginning. The replies get slower, the energy changes, the warmth becomes less obvious, they become quieter, less available, harder to read. And if you care deeply, that uncertainty can take over your whole mind. Because if they just need space, then maybe this is temporary. Maybe the bond is still safe. Maybe you just need to stay calm and not overreact. But if they are losing interest, then every extra day you spend explaining it away can keep you emotionally attached to something that is already slipping out of your hands. That is why this question hurts so much. It is not just about understanding them. It is about knowing whether to hold steady or start letting go. Today, I want to walk through the difference between someone needing space and someone losing interest, what people usually get wrong about both, and the signs that tell you whether distance is creating breathing room or quietly replacing the connection altogether. Stay with me until the end, because the final distinction is the one that matters most. And it has less to do with how much space they ask for and more to do with what the space is doing to the bond while you are inside it. The first thing to understand is that needing space is not automatically a bad sign. Healthy people need space sometimes. Tired people need space. Overwhelmed people need space. Emotionally flooded people need space. Even people who love you deeply can need room to think, regulate, recover, or reconnect with themselves. So distance by itself is not the full story. The real question is what kind of distance this is. When someone genuinely needs space, the space usually has shape. It has emotional integrity. It may still hurt, but it does not feel like you are being quietly erased. There is usually some effort to preserve the bond while they step back. Some signal that the connection still matters, even if they cannot engage in the same way right now. When someone is losing interest, the distance usually feels different. It is less about regulation and more about drift, less about protecting the bond while taking a breath, and more about slowly withdrawing emotional energy from it. The space does not just create room, it starts creating absence. That is why people get so confused. They look at the same external behavior and assume it must mean one thing. But the meaning of distance is not only in the fact that it exists, it is in how the person handles it, how they communicate it, how the connection feels inside it, and whether the space makes the bond clearer or weaker. One of the clearest signs that someone truly needs space is that they still act like the relationship matters while they are taking it. That sounds simple, but it changes everything. A person who needs space may become quieter for a while, but they usually do not make you feel disposable in the process. They may say they are overwhelmed, they may need time to think, they may need less intensity for a few days, they may not have much emotional capacity at the moment, but even then, there is often some sign of care around how they pull back. Maybe they reassure you. Maybe they explain instead of just disappearing. Maybe they set some expectation, even loosely. Maybe their tone still feels warm, even if it is reduced. Maybe when they do reach out, the contact still carries sincerity rather than obligation. This matters because needing space is about managing oneself, not casually destabilizing the other person. Someone who needs space but still values the bond usually tries, in whatever way they can, not to make the distance feel like silent punishment or emotional abandonment. They may not execute it perfectly, but you can often feel that the relationship still lives in their mind while they are stepping back. When someone is losing interest, that protective instinct often weakens. They do not just create distance. They become less concerned with how the distance is affecting the bond or you, and that is a major difference. Another sign that someone genuinely needs space is that the space tends to have a purpose. It may be emotional regulation, it may be stress, it may be burnout, it may be family pressure, work pressure, internal overwhelm, or even the need to process feelings more slowly. But there is usually some real inner reason the space exists. That does not mean the reason always sounds impressive. It just means the distance is connected to something real and specific inside them. When someone is losing interest, the distance often feels less purposeful and more passive. They do not seem to be stepping back in order to return with more clarity. They just seem to be fading. Their availability lowers, but nothing meaningful replaces it. Their presence thins out, but there is no sense of emotional direction inside the thinning. That is why "I just need space" can feel so confusing, because sometimes it is true. But sometimes it is a softer way of avoiding the discomfort of directly saying, "I do not have the same level of feeling or investment anymore." The difference usually becomes visible over time. Real space often creates eventual clarity. Fading interest often creates prolonged ambiguity. So when you are trying to tell the difference, pay attention to whether the distance seems connected to an actual emotional process, or whether it mostly feels like someone slowly slipping out of the bond without naming it. A person who genuinely needs space also tends to come back toward the connection with some level of coherence, not always quickly, not always perfectly, but the distance eventually leads somewhere. There is some return, some explanation, some effort to reconnect, some sense that the bond was paused, not quietly discarded. I want to take a quick moment to thank everyone who supports Soft Mind. Every cup I share with you, like this Chloe the Cat mug, reminds me of how this community grew from one quiet idea into something warm and real. Each Chloe the Cat item helps me keep creating these videos, so if you'd like to support the channel, you can grab your own cozy mug at colabbmusic.com. Thank you for being part of this calm space. That is because healthy space is meant to protect regulation, not to replace relationship. It gives breathing room so the connection can survive without unnecessary damage. It is not supposed to turn love into confusion. When someone is losing interest, the pattern usually feels different. The distance does not really restore anything. It just keeps stretching. The warmth becomes rarer. The contact becomes thinner. The explanations become vaguer. And instead of returning with more clarity, they often return only in fragments, just enough to stop the bond from fully collapsing while never giving it real life again. That is where people get trapped. Because a few fragments of attention can look like return, a small warm moment can look like hope. But if the overall pattern keeps weakening, then what you are seeing may not be healthy space at all. It may be slow disengagement with occasional flickers. That is why one of the biggest differences is this. Real space eventually helps the connection breathe again. Loss of interest slowly teaches the connection how to die without ever having to say so directly. One of the clearest signs that someone is losing interest is that your nervous system never actually settles inside the distance. Yes, missing someone can hurt even when the bond is safe. But there is a difference between missing someone and feeling chronically destabilized by them. When someone genuinely needs space, the distance may be painful, but it does not usually feel like your emotional reality is constantly being scrambled. There is still some thread of trust, some underlying sense that the bond has not been casually dropped. You may feel sad, you may feel uncertain, but you do not usually feel like you are disappearing from their heart in real time. When someone is losing interest, the distance often feels much more corrosive than that. You start monitoring everything: tone, timing, warmth, silence. You begin living in interpretation. You stop feeling like you are waiting with someone and start feeling like you are waiting to see whether they still care enough to come back at all. That distinction matters because when space is healthy, it may create discomfort, but it does not usually destroy your emotional footing. When interest is fading, the distance often creates a slow kind of panic, not always dramatic panic. Sometimes just the quiet, exhausting panic of trying to emotionally survive on weakening signals. And if the space keeps making you feel more erased than respected, that feeling deserves your attention. Another major difference is how they respond when you gently address the distance. Someone who needs space may not always have the perfect words, but they usually still show some willingness to acknowledge the relationship reality. They may say they are overwhelmed. They may admit they are not at their best. They may not be very expressive, but they often make some effort to help you understand that the distance is about capacity, not indifference. Someone losing interest often responds differently. They may become vaguer, more avoidant, more slippery, more likely to give just enough language to keep the conversation from forcing clarity, while still not giving you anything solid enough to emotionally rely on. This is where many people get trapped in false hope. They hear one soft sentence and use it to explain away a larger pattern of thinning investment. They think, well, they said they are just busy. They said they are just going through a lot. They said they still care. Maybe they do care, but words matter less than the full emotional shape of the pattern. A person who needs space and still values the bond usually does not only want to end the conversation. They want, at some level, to preserve the relationship while asking for breathing room. A person losing interest often wants relief from emotional responsibility more than they want truthful clarity. That is why their explanations can sound technically gentle while still leaving you feeling more alone. There is also a difference in what happens to tenderness. When someone needs space, tenderness often remains intact, even if access is reduced. The rhythm changes, but the care is still recognizable. The softness may be quieter, but it does not vanish. You can still feel that you matter. When someone is losing interest, tenderness often starts becoming selective, strained, or performative. It appears in short bursts, then disappears again. It feels less natural, less rooted, less emotionally alive. Instead of receiving care, you find yourself trying to interpret whether care is still there. And once you are monitoring tenderness instead of resting in it, something important has usually shifted. This is one of the hardest truths to accept because many people keep holding on to the occasional warm moment as proof that the connection is fine. But fading interest often hides behind occasional warmth. It uses just enough softness to interrupt your grief while the overall pattern continues moving away from you. That is why you have to stop measuring the bond only by its brief returns. Look at the larger emotional direction. Is the care becoming steadier again or more intermittent? Is the bond rebuilding or thinning? Are you feeling more secure over time or more hungry? The answer to that question tells you far more than a few good moments ever will. So what should you trust when you are stuck between these two possibilities? Trust the direction of the connection, not one conversation, not one explanation, not one warm night, not one cold day. Direction. Is the distance making space for healthier return, or is it slowly replacing the relationship with ambiguity? Is the bond being protected while they step back, or quietly neglected? Are you both still emotionally inside the connection, even if the rhythm is off? Or are you the only one trying to keep emotional meaning alive now? Direction tells the truth, because people who need space usually still move with some underlying regard for the bond, even when they are messy, even when they are imperfect, even when they do not know how to say everything well. There is still some effort to preserve emotional continuity. People who are losing interest usually move in the opposite direction. Less curiosity, less tenderness, less clarity, less momentum, less emotional gravity. The bond becomes something they keep around lightly instead of something they are actively trying to care for. And when that happens, what hurts most is not always the distance itself. It is realizing that you have been trying to honor the relationship while the other person has slowly stopped treating it like something alive. So what is the difference between needing space and losing interest? Needing space says, I cannot show up the same way right now, but the connection still matters to me. Losing interest says, I no longer have the same energy for this bond, and instead of naming that clearly, I may let distance do the speaking for me. One creates temporary room with some emotional integrity around it. The other creates prolonged confusion while emotional investment quietly drains out. That is why your job is not to become better at surviving ambiguity. Your job is to notice what kind of distance you are actually living inside. If the space still contains care, coherence, tenderness, and eventual return, then it may truly be space. If the distance keeps leaving you more anxious, more erased, more emotionally alone, and less certain of where you stand, then it may not be space at all. It may be loss, arriving slowly. If this episode gave language to something you have been trying to understand, let me know in the comments which distinction hit the hardest. And if you want more calm, honest conversations about love, attachment, mixed signals, and emotional clarity, subscribe to Soft Mind. Sometimes people really do need room, but sometimes what looks like space is just the slow disappearance of someone who no longer wants to say they are leaving.